Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the coupon code is HORROR, and it's good for 10% off any order of $10 or more, and it's going to run from October the 12th through November the 11th. That's right, our friends at Noble Knight hooked up a killer code for Halloween, and it's called HORROR. So put that in to get your discount code of 10% off any order of $10 or more, either online or if you're lucky enough to walk through those beautiful doors in person. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, but Hambone, I have so many games on my shelf that I don't know if I have any room for more games. Well, let me tell you something cool about our friends over at Noble Knight Games. They have a killer buy, sell, and trade program going on. And if you want to know more about that, check out nobleknight.com/buy, sell, trade. This is a great way for you to unload some of those games that maybe you don't love as much as you should, but somebody else would love it even more. Or if you've got a collection you're dying to get rid of to make more space, check out nobleknight.com/buy-sell-trade for more information on that. Otherwise, it's time to get a discount, and a killer discount at that. So 10% off any order of $10 or more, running from October the 12th through November the 11th, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. Happy Halloween from the Vintage RPG Podcast.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. I asked if he ever took a five-finger discount when he was a kid. He said, nah, man, my mom always had coupons. Stu Horvath.
It's not entirely true, but we're not going to talk about that.
Allegedly. How you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good. Thankful for statutes of limitations.
Here, here.
So today we're talking about Thieves World.
And that's the five-finger discount joke, folks. They do come from a certain place. They're not always good. They don't always land, but here we are. So, Stu, what is Thieves World?
So Thieves World is pretty weird and cool and very like late 70s, early 80s. It's a shared fantasy world. Well, city, really. The city is called Sanctuary, and it was created by Robert Lynn Asprin and Lynn Abbey. And basically, Thieves World was a series of short story anthologies all set in Sanctuary, and a whole bunch of different writers contributed and kind of built the world and the characters and wove those stories all together. It's interesting. I like a lot of it. But yeah, you have like Paul Anderson, you have Marion Zimmer Bradley, you have a lot of names that you're going to recognize contributed over the years. And it's kind of cool because it's a low magic, gritty kind of thief-infested city. It's been recently conquered, so there's a lot of political stuff. The gods are sort of also involved in like an indirect way. It's a cool thing that you don't see anymore. There were a couple different collaborative series like this. Wild Cards was another one, which was superheroes. It was actually based on the Chaosium game Super World that was run by George R.R. Martin.
Oh, did he finish that book? Or just waiting for the next one to come out?
Well, he farmed it out, so he didn't have to, there's a whole bunch of people writing with it. And yeah, I think there was another one that was like a prequel to the Ringworld books that detailed the war in that universe. But like, I think that that's just a really interesting model for genre writing where you take a world, you create it together, and you populate it together, and then you kind of just see what happens over time. I have something like, 8 or 9 volumes of Thieves World, and they're interesting. Eventually, there's fish people that take over, and it gets weird. As you could expect, things sort of spiral out of control eventually when you have like a collaborative thing, like a D&D game,
Right.
At the end of the D&D campaign, you're sort of like, wow, how did we get here? And the same sort of thing happens in Thieves World. Of more importance to me is there was graphic novel adaptations. It was basically Tim Sale's first big gig as a comic book artist. Yeah, they are fantastic. Tim Sale's artwork does like a really good job of sort of unifying the disparate sort of vibes of the short stories. There's 6 or 7 of them. I highly recommend checking them out if you're interested in Thieves World. But the books are easy to find. Any used bookstore that has like vintage paperbacks will have them for like $1 each. Like seriously, there's like piles of them at the Montclair Book Center. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the Thieves World box set from Chaosium, published in 1981. Around the time, I guess there's 3 volumes of Thieves World anthologies out, and they were very, very popular at the time. And this was a kind of a big coup for Chaosium to get the Thieves World license, because a lot of people were really interested in picking this up. And it does a really good job of portraying a bustling, seedy city for a fantasy setting. Thieves World isn't a self-contained role-playing game. I don't want to say it's system agnostic, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's for use in whatever rule system that you want to use. You could drop Sanctuary in and visit and play there. This is a few years before Lankmar comes out, and I think for the time, it's probably, for my money, the best role-playing city as a setting for an adventure. I think they do a couple things that make the world come alive in an interesting way. Most importantly, they have all these charts for random encounters. And they're not random encounters like, oh my god, there's an owlbear. They're random encounters in that, like, they focus on the movement of people through the city. So it's like a merchant or, a bar brawl or, a thief getting arrested. Like, they're things for player characters to witness and intercede on if they want. Basically, like, you're walking down the street and something happens.
Oh, so it's like an environmental encounter rather than like a wandering monster.
Yeah, I don't really think that there was anything like that up until this point. And that might be because a lot of the people who are designing these games weren't living in, big cities. It reminds me of, wandering around New York City and just stuff is happening constantly all around you that you're mostly not even a spectator to. It's just happening and you're ignoring it because, like, you have to go someplace.
Right. Not everybody got pickpocketed in the 80s
in
New York City.
I never got mugged or anything. Nothing terrible has ever happened to me in New York City. Well, there's some things, but, like, no physical violence. Some stuff with poop.
And rats.
I think that that's a really unique way of bringing the fictional city to life, because, like, most of the stuff worries about, like, the characters that you're going to meet and have weighty interactions with. And the other kind of pillar of city design is just, like, make the buildings and the places interesting. And that kind of, like, pigeonholes people into, like, the job or their function at that building. Whereas, like, this is very street level, and as we learned from Shadowrun, Sprawl Sites, and Night City for Cyberpunk, the street is where, like, the city lives and breathes, where the personality happens. Like, it's not the functionaries in their office building, right? And I think that the same thing happens in the Thieves World box, where these random encounters really fuel that feel of bustle in the city and gives it its character. It allows you to kind of define that character dependent upon what you want and what your players are expecting. And this is 1981. We're 5 years in, and I think that that is just a brilliant bit of design genius coming out of Chaosium that early.
So a little while ago, you mentioned how the system is not quite system agnostic. How does that work? Is it compatible with the world's greatest role-playing game?
It is one of the very few role-playing products that is. It's actually compatible with just about everything that was on the market in 1981.
Really?
Yeah. So somebody was talking recently about how you can kind of look at Chaosium and see how over the years, a lot of important people kind of came and went, and all of these relationships were fostered over the decades, right? And I think that this is one of the early points where you could see how friendly and how well regarded within the industry by creative people Chaosium was. This is unheard of. And it might just be a function of the moment in time. 1981's still very early. Everybody's still very niche. It's still sort of the Wild West.
Right.
So basically the stats are keyed to each sort of important character from the Thieves World stories, and you get stats for each system. And those systems are Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, Adventures in Fantasy, Chivalry and Sorcery, Dragon Quest, Dungeons & Dragons, The Fantasy Trip, RuneQuest, Traveler, the science fiction game, Tunnels and Trolls, and that's it. But, like, that's a crazy-ass cross-section of role-playing game companies at that time. And the fact that TSR is involved in any way is sort of mind-boggling to me. I believe that part of it was tied up with the deities and demigods thing.
Right. Like, yeah, you guys kind of screwed up, but if you play nice, we'll play nice kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that Chaosium was generally playing nice, but they were smart in how they leveraged it. And you can see immediately after this, TSR really hunkers down. Like, everybody mistakes the fact that there was a lawsuit or anything around that deities and demigods. There wasn't. Chaosium was fine with it. All they wanted was Chaosium to have their name in the book. TSR hated that. The second edition has Chaosium listed as the rights holder, but that was like really a bridge too far, and that's why they cut the content, not because of any kind of lawsuit. It was because they couldn't stand the idea of promoting a competitor.
Well, I mean, corporate is corporate. And that said, in 1981, TSR was still like baby corporate.
Yeah.
You know, where it's like, it's corporate, but it's kind of still mom and pop corporate-ish. Not like it is now where it's corporate. So you could get away with some stuff like that back in the day, which definitely not now. Like that would go over like a lead fart in church.
Sort of. I think that there is still kind of room for that. But like, yeah, I think that you're right. I think that because it was sort of baby's first corporation, they overcompensated and were too restrictive on stuff. But I think that it's cool that out of that came this weird cross-section of games that you could use Thieves World and just plug it in. Traveler, the science fiction game in space with ships. You have stats for all of these fantasy characters. It's such a great idea.
That's awesome.
And I think that that just speaks to the way Chaosium's character was then and I think now. This book was really spearheaded by Lynn Willis, who is integral to Call of Cthulhu. But Greg Stafford was involved. Like, it was a whole company effort, and it was a big license, and they pulled it down. And the Thieves World box set is, I think, one of the most desired things Chaosium put out in that early era. Maybe partly just because, you know, you don't usually see D&D stats in a book that isn't by TSR.
Yeah, seriously.
And just to illustrate how fleeting a moment this was, Chaosium in 1986 put out the Thieves World Companion, which basically covered the events of the next 3 Thieves World anthologies. A lot changed. As I said, there are fish people who take over the city, and it's like an extra occupational force. But at this point, there's a whole lot less people participating. You know, 5 years later, there's just 2 systems represented in the Companion. RuneQuest, which is Chaosium's in-house fantasy role-playing game.
Obviously.
And MERP from Iron Crown Enterprises. Those are the only 2 that you get stats for.
Wow, not even Tunnels and Trolls?
At this point, you know, Fantasy Trip and Adventures in Fantasy, and I think maybe even Chivalry and Sorcery, Dragon Quest also, they had their moment and they've disappeared. And then, you know, D&D obviously wasn't going to participate any longer.
Yeah, not at that point.
It's an interesting sort of slice of history in that, like, you know, it was just this moment of great collaboration followed by, you know, tragedy for some of the games and a more corporate outlook for others. And that was it. And that was the end. There were 2 Thieves World products from Chaosium. And they're pretty great for what they are.
And rare, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, they're hard to come by. My box set is in I would say, sorry shape. It's still holding together, but, you know.
Yeah, it's holding the place. But if something else comes along,
well, yeah. And one of the nice things about the box set, too, is that you get the great Walter Velez cover art from the novels on there. He's just so good. And weird thing, he eventually did some work for TSR and their Mystara line for 2nd edition. So there's all these connections, like, you know, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Like, you could do that with Chaosium in the role-playing world, and it's just like everybody is like only like a handful of connections away. I think if you went to 6 Degrees, it'd be too easy.
Yeah, I mean, Chaosium is kind of like the cousin that everyone gets along with and everyone likes and doesn't really have anything bad to say about. They just kind of like go to whatever party and hang out.
Yeah, I mean, like, we had James Lauder on the show, so like, we're literally one connection away from Chaosium. Like,
there you go, folks. You're always closer than you think. Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Thieves World?
I love Thieves World. It's definitely a product of its time. It reads very like late 70s, early 80s. And if you're familiar with this stuff, you know what I mean. But I think overall, it's an interesting setting. I think that Thieves World, the box set, is one of the most important city designs, certainly in early role-playing games. And it's a super interesting moment in role-playing history. But most of all, I think you should really check out those Tim Sale graphic novels because they're really good. Tim Sale is awesome.
Right on, man. So, folks, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram, posting every day at Vintage RPG about role-playing games like Thieves World and Dungeons & Dragons and Adventures in Fantasy and a fantasy trip. And not Traveler yet, though. I still don't know what to say about that one, but we'll get there. I promise.
We certainly will. You can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. You can follow my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you like the show, don't be shy about rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the show. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, go on over to patreon.com/vintagerpg. We got a lot of extras there. We got some early release episodes. We got videos. Stu's got some backstage info on the book he's writing. I've got some behind the scenes for the game that I'm making. So we have a lot of cool stuff over there. We've also got a really awesome community on Discord, including a specific Discord channel just for the patrons. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.